Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce, mediation, and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we'll discuss business value drivers with John Warilow. He is the founder of the Value Builder System, which is a practice management software for business advisors. And he has a best-selling book called Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You. It was recognized by both Fortune and Inc. magazine as one of the best business books and has been translated into 12 languages. He's also written a few more books that we'll talk to you later about. But prior to founding the Value Builder System, he started and exited 4 different companies, including one acquired by a public company. He lives with his family in Toronto, and you can follow him by signing up at builttosell.com. He also has a podcast, and we'll talk more about that as well. We push this off into the middle, but I think that it's relevant. What are we seeing happening right now with business owners that may have been hit hard during the pandemic? A lot of people have been hyper successful. That may also not continue, right? The hard times or the wonderful times may not continue. So what do we do now post-pandemic? Where do you see the future going in some of these companies in selling?
Yeah, well, we've actually done some research. So we looked at people who completed the Value Builder questionnaire prior to March of 2020. So prior to the pandemic being sort of globally announced. And then compared to the next 9 months. So the kind of calling it during the pandemic, as it were. I realize we're not out of it yet, but that was the sort of window we looked at. So pre and during. And we looked at all of the ways they answered the Value Builder questionnaire, and we analyzed them to see if the pandemic has caused any change in behavior. And there were a few that were really interesting. One is that the proportion of business owners who told us their exit intent was to pass their business to their kids has dropped off the floor, off a cliff.
Okay.
It has been replaced by people who expect to sell to a third party. Now, the number of people that used Value Builder that tell us their exit intent is to sell to a third party is over 50%, 50%. And the proportion that's planned to pass their business to their kids has dropped from double digits, 18, 19, to less than 10%. That's a profound change. And I think what's going on is this pandemic has been really catastrophic for a lot of businesses, in particular service businesses. And the idea of passing that albatross down to my kids has just become untenable. I don't want to pass that burden on. So I'd rather sell for the best I can do and get out. So that's number one. The second big trend we're seeing is that people have pulled forward their sell-by date, right? I mean, this has been a near-death experience for a lot of people, right? In some cases, literally, in other cases, just figuratively, it's been catastrophic and traumatic in many, many ways. And therefore, people have had a near-death experience and they've said, life's too short. I don't want to just keep running this business forever. There are other things I want to do with my life. And so we've seen business owners bring forward their sell-by date by about 20%. In other words, we ask them on the Value Builder questionnaire, like, when do you plan on selling? 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And the proportion of said we're bringing it forward is grown by 20%. So we're seeing people want to sell sooner and sell to a third party. And it raises the issue of, and this gets back to your comment earlier about sort of timing, and that is when's the right time to sell? And I think the right time to at least ask yourself the question is when you crest something called the freedom point. And the freedom point is the point at which the sale of your company will generate enough liquid wealth to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And I think at that point, it's worth at least pulling up and saying, is now the right time, right? Because for most owners, some owners want to be the next Steve Jobs, the next, Elon Musk. But for most owners, I think their highest aspiration is for freedom, is independence. Like, that's why they got into business and didn't go to work for Procter & Gamble. Like, they want independence. And when you reach that, when you achieve that, and the sale of your business would allow you to be fully financially free, I think it's just worth pulling up, asking the question, is now the right time? I'm reminded of a guy I interviewed. Have you ever had a guy named Rand Fishkin on the show, Melissa?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, Rand, I would say if you haven't had him on,
no, we haven't had him on. No.
He would be a great guest if you ever need a great guest. He wrote a wonderful book called Lost and Founder about his experience. I had a chance to interview him on Built to Sell Radio, and he described the growth and subsequent loss of his company Moz. So Moz was in the SEO, search engine optimization space, built it up to 5 million in revenue when he got a call from HubSpot. Brian Halligan, co-founder of HubSpot, wanted to buy his business, and they offered him $25 million of cash and HubSpot stock for a $5 million company. And Rand was a young guy at the time, is still a young guy, but it was even younger then, and had sort of in his ear somebody telling him that a SaaS company, a software as a service company, should be trading at 4 times future revenue multiple. So he thought that while they were at 5 today, he thought they could get to 10. And so in his mind, he's multiplying 4 times 10 or $40 million for this little $5 million business. And so he says to Brian Halligan, it's 40 million or nothing. And Halligan says, well, it'll have to be nothing then, and then walked away. And they kind of parted ways. And instead of selling the business, Rand raised venture capital. And the way the VCs invested is they get preferred shares. They guarantee them a preferred return before the founder shares get anything. And that's an important part of the story, because as the business grew and the VCs wanted Rand to spend more and more of their money, they got into bunch of different product lines they weren't really in the business of being in. They weren't very differentiated. The company started to bleed cash, so much so that they removed Rand as the CEO. And I interviewed him at this point. I said, well, at least you've got your Moz shares. They must be worth like a truckload, right? And he said, actually, John, I don't think they're worth anything. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, based on the way the VCs invested with preferred shares and the length of time they've held these shares, like I don't think I'm going to get any money out of Moz. And I said, but Rand, what would that offer of $25 million from HubSpot be worth today based on the appreciation of HubSpot stock? They're now a public company, et cetera. And he said it'd be worth close to $200 million. And I remember that story every time we're talking about this notion of sort of timing your exit. When's the right time to sell? Have I reached my freedom point? When you reach your freedom point where the sale of your company would create enough liquid wealth, $25 million at the time would have been enough. It is enough and will have been enough for Rand to live for 3 generations, let alone 1. Yet he chose to turn it down. So it's just this, I think, important point that at the very least, we should all pull up and say is now the right time.
Yeah. And I think it's doing some of those self-critical analyses of saying, what are we doing well? What are we doing wrong? There's a concept that, what do you have control over? How can you see the future? You had control over the 25 million, but people kind of get interested in making more. At some point, I think a business owner has to be like, is it enough?